Hiring the wrong dev team can be catastrophic for your company. I've hired hundreds of engineers and also provided hundreds of engineers to other firms. So I know firsthand, having made even mistakes before, of how painful it is to hire the wrong engineer, and also how difficult it is sometimes to spot it early. A lot of times, a bad engineer can be actually hidden away for months and months before you fully realize that they are not gonna take you where you need to go. So let's talk about how to spot a bad engineer so that you can understand whether you should stay or you should go. So one of the first things I'll say is that a lot of founders sometimes make hiring based on price and not on skill set. Let me explain. Basically, by only looking at the price tag, you're not taking into consideration, are they actually having the skill set to accomplish what you need to do? You have to match experience with the actual business objective that you are trying to set for this engineer. So on one hand, if you're just trying to build something very MVP, low fidelity, then maybe hiring a more younger or less experienced engineer for a lower price tag is more appropriate. But if you're trying to go for something a lot more complex, then if you hire the junior or mid engineer who is not able to handle it, then you may not have such a actual bad engineer, but that engineer may not be appropriate for the task you're giving them. And ultimately, if the engineer builds the wrong thing, even if you save money on building it, it's still the wrong thing. And ultimately, it's gonna cost you more money to have to rebuild it or to build off of bad code, because there's so much technical debt associated with it that you are not going to save any money anyways. And the right thing to do is hire the right engineer for the right experience level at the right price tag. Oftentimes you do get what you paid for. Miscommunication all the time. An engineer that's really effective needs to be able to communicate with you extremely effectively. Understanding requirements and building the right thing is not as simple as you would think. It requires actually the engineer or whoever is building your product to really understand what is it that you're saying and what is the goals. So an engineer who does not properly understand the requirements, does not understand the scope, will always end up building the wrong thing. So communication is not a nice to have, it's actually absolutely essential. The engineer needs to understand deeply about what you need to accomplish. And so if you're finding out very often that the engineer is misunderstanding or not communicating effectively, then that engineer will not be able to deliver what you need. And it's just going to cause more and more frustrations in the long term. It is just simply not something you can solve overnight. There are things that you can do with your operations, as I've managed multiple engineering operations before, that you can set up a system where you're creating a Loom video or you're detailing the requirements on paper and you're doing a lot more effort like drawing up or sketching things, basically to give the engineer as much context as possible to understand. However, if you do everything on your side to try to communicate as clearly as possible and the engineer still doesn't get it, then that may be a communication barrier that you may not be able to overcome. So it's better to just move on. But make sure that you are doing everything you can to make sure the requirements are very clear. One thing that I've seen non-technical founders do that basically sets a project up for failure, and it's not necessarily the engineer's fault, is giving very unclear requirements. Basically giving very broad, generalized things about, I want this, I want that. And now the engineer, if he's excellent, can clarify and try to get to the root of it. However, a lot of engineers may not do that as well. And really then the ownership falls on you to be very clear in documenting your requirements, shooting Loom videos, providing clear documentation and requirements, doing sketches to make it as clearly as possible. Now, if you are giving very unclear requirements all the time, then you have to consider, when the engineer builds the wrong thing, did you do your job to communicate effectively with this engineer? And then in vice versa, did the engineer communicate with you to clarify the requirements? Both communications needs to happen in parallel, meeting in the middle to ensure that the right thing gets built. The last thing to check is to talk about what is their quality assurance. Oftentimes, engineers will build things, but not expect the QA to be happening by them. They'll leave the QA to the business stakeholders or someone else. This is a huge red flag. Whoever is implementing your feature needs to care deeply that it is working in the right way and is not incurring what's called technical debt. Let me explain. Whoever is building your feature needs to ensure that it's working as best as possible, doing the right thing to QA themselves locally, but also building testing to ensure that in the future, as you build more and more features, that it's not going to break other things. An engineer needs to care very deeply about the quality of not just the features that are being developed, but the overall system. So things that you need to probe is that when you are building features and adding more and more things to the roadmap, are you finding that it's getting more and more difficult to basically deliver? This implies that the foundation of the code is not stable. What happens is that as you add more and more lines of code, it's getting more and more complex to actually work around the code to ensure that it's working. This implies that the system and the architecture is not scalable, and actually the engineer is not giving quite the right quality concerns about how to build a scalable system. This is a massive red flag, and actually the hardest for non-technical founders to capture, because it's quite unclear sometimes whether the feature is complex or the system or the foundation that they're building on is not stable, so that it's causing a lot more effort to build features on top of it. Technical debt is almost impossible to avoid. In fact, with the first assumptions that you build a system with, it is actually going to change dramatically as your platform matures and as your business matures. However, you should not be finding that within like the first few weeks of developing the initial system that technical debt is already incurring. This implies that either the original scope was wrong or the foundation of the code is very actually already complex and causing issues, and the engineer just didn't build it correctly. So make sure that you're probing from the beginning what is the velocity of delivering features. If the engineer has built the right system, then that means that ultimately these features should not be taking a long time to build one after the other. So if you're having these main issues with regarding to the speed, the communication, the quality, that means that you may need to move on. And usually these issues are not happening in isolation. If you're having one of these issues, you're probably having the other two as well, because they're all related to each other. Fundamentally, it's thinking about how do all these pieces interact with each other to deliver the right thing. Communicating, being able to work quickly, being able to work with quality. These are the signs of a really, really good engineer. And so if you're not able to get that from your current engineer, my advice is to act quickly. The reality is the situation is not going to get much better, okay? In fact, it may get even worse. So looking for backups, looking for ways to audit and ultimately get redundancy. And when I mean redundancy, I'm talking about having backups to your engineer. So having another engineer understand the code. So if you need to transition, it's very smooth to transition. It may cost a little bit to do the handoff, but ultimately what it does is create security and handoff for your code base. So my advice is don't burn the bridges when you're letting go. There's no need to make this an extremely emotional affair, because what happens is, unfortunately, there are times where if you leave in very bad terms, that the engineer will not cooperate with you on the handoff. And that's a huge mistake as well. Now, this is just the reality of things. You do not want to have a very tumultuous handoff and do it too quickly, because if critical pieces get missed, it's very difficult for the next engineer to pick it up in an effective way. So make sure that you handle this transition very cleanly, professionally, and make it in a way that it's going to be very smooth for the knowledge to transfer from one engineer to the other, the next one that you're working on. I've linked a video about how to interview the engineers in the right way and the right questions to ask so you can make the best hiring decision next time. And if you need help hiring the right dev team, then give me a call and I'm happy to work with you to figure out how to get the right engineering resources into your team. I'll see you next time.